Hi, Renard 250. My name's Mark Poesch. I'm an associate professor here in the Department of Renewable Resources. I was scheduled to give a guest lecture in your class, but unfortunately I had my schedule mixed up and I couldn't make it. But David and I talked, and we thought that it would be important for you to get the material, and so I'm presenting this, and the slides will be on eClass. As far as a lecture on assessing aquatic ecosystems in Canada and some of the issues that we're facing. So to give you a brief outline, I'm going to cover three main topics that are rather broad, and so we will be doing this kind of in a quick and sort of view from above. And the first is understanding the decline in aquatic, in particular freshwater biodiversity. This is something that I study here at the University of Alberta, and many people are unaware of the sort of magnitude of declines that we see in fresh waters. I'm going to talk about the legal landscape and what it is that we actually use to protect fish, in particular two frameworks, the Species at Risk Act and the Fisheries Act, because it's important for you to understand not just the crisis, but what is the solution, and the solution is to protect the legal protections that we have. And then finally, I'm going to talk to you about how do we manage projects on the ground when we think there's going to be some destruction of fish or fish habitat, and talk to you about how we go about compensating for that. So strap in. It's going to be a bit of a broad lecture, but covering three very important areas. So many people view sort of freshwater systems like this picture, where we have sort of an abundance of fish sort of swimming around, and underneath this sort of pristine water that we can't actually see through. But in fact, this is a misnomer. In fact, we are going through an immense crisis as far as biodiversity in fresh waters. And I'll start back all the way to talk about why we see these declines, looking at this through the origin and perhaps the demise of species. And so I take these are handwritten notes from Darwin during his voyage of the Beagle in 1836, where he looks at and starts to hypothesize what is required to have the stability of species. And this question of how do we maintain species diversity or even abundances was thought in the 125th anniversary edition of the very high impact journal Science to be one of science's most important questions. And Stephen Jay Gould, the famous ecologist, said the paradox is that poor design is a better argument for evolution than good design, and that we do see some rather strange things that have come out, and what are the reasons for that. And so Darwin noted that the ordinary rules of stability can be altered by things like limited resources, which creates competition for those resources, heterogeneity in the environment, this struggle to survive, which creates, again, this competition, which means that we're going to have the inheritance of fit genes to our offspring through the process of natural selection. And gradually, although Stephen Jay Gould argues this is not necessarily gradual, that this will lead to the diversity that we see in life. And so here's the handwritten note of Darwin creating the first sort of tree of life, which has really sort of promoted his ideas of natural selection. But these rules that have governed species for millions of years, in some cases for fish, tens of millions of years, have been drastically altered by the way humans have changed landscapes, as demonstrated by this picture here. And it's now believed that the extinction rates that we see are 100 to 1,000 times greater than we see from some natural background level that we're able to measure. And so this has led many to fear that we are undergoing a biodiversity crisis. And so take a moment and think about what taxa you think is most at risk based on sort of your experience or your classes. Is it birds, terrestrial mammals, freshwater mussels, freshwater fish, or amphibians? And I'm not sure if many of you know this very impressive fish species. It's the paddlefish. It used to be a species that was native to the Great Lakes in Canada, but has been extirpated. due to overharvest. It still exists in sort of southern United States, but is an example of sort of this crisis that we've been seeing for quite some time now. And the rates in particular of freshwater species decline is really what's quite alarming. It's thought to be 5 times higher than things that are happening on the terrestrial landscape. And there are many reasons why this may be. One is that we don't see necessarily what's underneath the water. And that original picture of lots of fish is our perception. And fish are typically more difficult to sample. And the alarming part is the rates of decline that we see are increasing while rates of recovery are not. And so what we've seen since this was a paper done comparing from 1989 to more current times, we've seen a 92% increase in the species that have been listed. So more things are starting to decline. And unfortunately, of the ones that were in peril back in 1989, most, about 90%, are in the same or worse condition. So not only are more things declining, the ones that we've already assessed as being imperiled are not getting any better. And so here are different freshwater taxa from across Canada and the rates of which these species are listed as far as having some rate of decline. And so freshwater mussels are another species that are taxa that are understudied. They're very, they're underneath the water. We don't see them. They're difficult to sample. But I want you to note that of the different taxonomic groups, freshwater mussels, freshwater fish, and amphibians all are sort of the top 4 as far as leading taxonomic declines. And so this poses an important question: is what's happening in Canada's freshwater to create this biodiversity crisis? And so for fish, let's think about what is the most important threat to species. Okay, so is it that we're just over-harvesting? Is it the effect of pollution, invasive species, habitat alteration, or competition with native species? And remember, this is just for freshwater fish. So take a moment to think about it. So this is an interesting picture. This is Asian carp in the Mississippi drainage, which leads through Chicago, which is right on the forefront of making into the Great Lakes. And so you may have seen this species. They're very sensitive to vibrations, and so when you traverse a river with a boat, this is kind of what you see, and it can be quite dangerous at times. But in fact, it's not invasive species, or in this graph, alien species. It's actually habitat alteration. And it's one of the things that I wanted you to think about as far as a take-home. So when we talk about the legal framework in a moment, it's not actually that we don't have laws in place to protect fish and fish habitat, it's the implementation. So these small little death by 1,000 cuts, I think is one of the main reasons that we're continuing to make alterations to habitat over and over again, which add up over time. And so, yes, it's habitat alteration, although it's not to neglect the effects of invasive species and other things. Harvest is one of the main drivers of declines in marine systems, but it is relatively minor to other things. And so it's sometimes difficult to assess what do we mean by changing in rates of decline over time, and sort of figuring out what we had versus what we have now can be rather difficult. But I was able to pull this from various resources to show you examples of fish that are now extinct that we once had in North America. And so 40 of North America's about 1,000 freshwater fish have gone extinct in the past century. This doesn't sound maybe so bad, a 0.4% per decade decline, but it's thought by this famous paper by Riccardi and Rasmussen that this is going to increase several fold, up to 6-fold, and be a 2.4% per decade decline in the future. And so that increase in extinction rate is really quite troubling. So what is the solution to protecting Canada's freshwater biodiversity? Well, we have a few key legislative tools in our toolbox. Species at Risk Act, which received royal assent only in 2002, which seems like not that long ago when you consider how long we've been noticing these declines. But this was Canada's reaction to the Rio Convention on Biodiversity. It should be noted that species are listed in various ways or recommended by COSEWIC and then go to the minister for listing. And only species that are listed on Schedule 1, those that are listed as threatened, endangered, or ironically extirpated, receive protection. Species that are of special concern or other listings do not receive protection. We also have the Fisheries Act. This is the federal act that governs the management, protection, and conservation of fish and fish habitats. And there are various provisions that allow protection for issues related to the decline of fish. Things like habitat protection provisions are shown in sections 20 to 35. There's also pollution prevention provisions and, in fact, even metal mining effluent regulations. And there's also the Ocean Acts, but we're not going to talk about that as we're going to concentrate on freshwaters for today. So fisheries and oceans, Canada are the main sort of governing body responsible for that administers the fish habitat protection provisions under the Fisheries Act. We also have DFO administering provisions of the Species at Risk Act on behalf of Environment Canada and Climate Change, who do the other listings. And they participate in environmental assessments and regulatory reviews and for these listings. And so what are the things that are sort of protected, or what are the federal government interested in? Well, works or undertakings in and around fish habitat. So this can be things like bridges that have like footings within water, culverts, especially if they're not allowing fish passage, diversion dikes, airstrips, infills, etc. Things like tailing impoundment areas, but this is specific. The Fisheries Act only protects fish frequented waters. So tailings ponds in the oil sands regions don't technically meet that definition. Water intakes and water withdrawal. The use of explosives in fish frequented water, which is often done for things like construction. The expansion of port facilities. Increased access to the fisheries resource, and then things like mitigation and habitat compensation measures, which we'll talk about later in this class. So let's talk about now the Species at Risk Act. This again was received royal assent in 2002, and this was Canada's sort of response to the UN Convention of Biological Diversity. And the intent of SARA is to provide scientific assessment and listing of species to preserve native biodiversity, but also by law there's a requirement to provide a recovery plan. And for species that listed as endangered, this recovery plan needs to be written and implemented within 2 years, and for threatened species this is 5 years. And one of the key provisions that need to be identified in this recovery plan is the protection of what is referred to as critical habitat. Habitat that is essential for the species to meet all of its life requirements. There is this allowable harm measure, so you can kill species at risk, and there are various compensation and enforcement measures. So who legally designates species at risk? Is it COSEWIC, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada, whatever province that has jurisdiction, the Minister of DFO, or the Prime Minister? So take a moment to think about this. It's actually a bit of a trick question. It's technically the Minister of Environment, Canada and Climate Change, but however, for things like fresh waters and marine mammals and marine species, they allow the Minister of DFO to make that jurisdictional call. COSEWIC is the body that provides scientific recommendations. I've sat for 2 terms, 10 years on the Freshwater Fish Subcommittee, and we assess, we basically go through a very rigorous assessment process, and we put a recommendation for those listings. Once we make the recommendation, the fisheries minister must make a decision, but this is a bit of a loophole. Okay, there's a number of different things that are done at this time. And so DFO Science Sector conducts a recovery potential assessment in my 4th year class. We attempt to actually recreate what one of these looks like. This is a science-based, rigorous assessment of what are the threats affecting each species and what's the potential for recovery. DFO policy sector at the same time conducts a socioeconomic assessment. And this is typically done by surveying stakeholders and what the effect of listing a species may have for socioeconomic benefits. And so this is not an, so the first one, the science sector recovery potential assessment, is it's held under closed doors, but there are recordings that are placed there, and then there are notes that are provided, and so the public can always ask for those notes or recordings. The socioeconomic analysis is done under closed doors, and there's no notes or recordings, and so it's kind of been like a straw poll of stakeholders. And so it's been argued that the Species at Risk Act is very limited by this sort of uneven approach, sort of peer-reviewed, open, rigorous science versus closed-door socioeconomic analysis. Consultations are then conducted and then recommended through online portal to ask the public to respond. And then a recommendation is provided to the minister. But the minister ultimately makes the call. List, don't list, or reassess. And there's another loophole here in that the minister does not necessarily have to follow the recommendation that's provided. They could deviate from this based on now what is rewritten in certain acts as what is in the public good, which is not clearly defined. And the minister doesn't have a timeline for listing. And so this is one of the criticisms under the previous Harper government, is that they had many recommendations that were brought to the minister, but the minister made no decision, and it just sat on a desk. Okay, so recovery strategies outlines the goal of the recovery framework. My apologies, the years I got you were a little bit off. So 3 years are required for endangered species and 4 years for threatened species. And they need to outline specific measures that need to be taken on the ground to implement the recovery strategy. And so these things include recovery targets. So how many individuals do we need in a population? How many populations, and what is the target growth rate? This also protects critical habitat, the habitat needed to support a recovered population, and looks at mitigation of threats so that whatever is causing the declines can be mitigated. Although there is a section 73, that allows allowable harm, but only to the extent that, so this means that you could do projects that harm or kill endangered species, but only to the extent that it will not jeopardize the survival or recovery of that species, which in many cases is unknown because some of these species are rather understudied. So under the Species at Risk Act, this is one of my favorite definitions under Section 32, it is illegal to kill, harm, harass. I love that people are going to harass endangered fish. Capture or take an individual is listed as extirpated, endangered, or threatened. You cannot also possess, collect, buy, sell, or trade an individual of a listed species under that Schedule 1 criteria. And so there's also the basic prohibition of damaging or destroying species residents. And so this differs a little bit. This is a habitat meant to be a habitat protection. So you can't affect the residents, but it's a rather broad definition. And this includes all of the processes that the fish will go through. So a residence is defined as a dwelling or place, such as a den, nest, or other similar area or place that's occupied or habitually occupied by one or more individuals during all or part of their life cycles, including breeding, rearing, staging, wintering, feeding, or hibernating. And so basically, from the moment a fish is born to the moment the fish dies, including the sort of laying of eggs, that is considered to be the species residence, is under protection under Section 33. Critical habitat is this protection, so it's the habitat necessary for the survival or recovery of a species and needs to be by law identified in the recovery plan. And the ironic part is people who think that Canada's legislative requirements are too onerous, which is what has been referred to in previous changes of the Fisheries Act, may not be aware that the Species at Risk Act has been legally tested in a number of cases, and in a few cases that I'm going to show you, it's been shown to actually be the lack of protection that has been problematic with the species at risk. And there are two key rulings here. One is the killer whale ruling. And so in this ruling, they looked at 87 individuals in the southern orca population. DFO had a recovery plan, but they left certain elements up to the discretion of the minister. And the minister made changes to the scientific assessment of what is critical habitat, or asked for changes. And so the DFO was brought into court, and the court said the recovery plan must be enshrined in law. And so these things were considered to be part of critical habitat. They must preserve Chinook salmon. They must reduce underwater noise. They must restrict industrial and military activity and clean up toxic contamination. And so this is a very important ruling for species at risk in Canada, and ensures that the protection of critical habitat in the recovery plan must be enshrined in law. It cannot be at the discretion of the minister. The second ruling that was tested was in British Columbia on the Nooksack dace that live in only 4 streams. DFO in this case identified habitat maps in the recovery strategy, but the minister removed them. And the court decision said that the minister was in clear contravention of the law and reluctant to be held accountable for failure to follow the law. And so these examples really highlight sort of the testing grounds for the Species at Risk Act. And so I covered this already, so you probably know the answer, but can you kill a species at risk? Yes or no? And the answer is technically yes, under a certain number of caveats. And this falls under those allowable harm provisions under Section 73. And so harmful activities can be authorized under permit if it's scientific research related to the conservation of the species and is conducted by a qualified person. But even though I'm a university professor, I've had numerous arguments about this provision in that DFO has attempted to prevent me from studying certain species or has put limitations on that. And so the argument is that science benefits the species and it's required to enhancing its survival in the wild. And also harmful activities are allowed if it's incidental to carrying out an activity. And so these are the 3 proponents. Is it scientific research? Does it benefit the species? Or is it incidental to carrying out the activity? But you must consider reasonable lower impact activities, minimize impacts by all feasible measures, and ensure that any activity that would not jeopardize the species' survival or recovery. Okay, we'll walk through the Fisheries Act. So this is Canada's legislation to protect fish resource, fish and fish habitat. And this is a sort of multi-jurisdictional approach. So the federal government has the federal mandate and the Fisheries Act, but the province and territorial governments actually govern recreational fisheries. And so there are a number of important provisions under the Fisheries Act, including Section 20, Safe Passage of Fish. This includes things like if you have a hanging culvert, you're required by law to fix that hanging culvert. And if this is like an industry road, like a forestry or oil and gas road, it's the industry's responsibility to fix those hanging culverts. And in Alberta, we have tens of thousands of these. And industry has argued that like if they were required to fix all their hanging culverts, well, they would just all be out of business. And so in Alberta, there is a bit of a provincial group that is looking to try and identify sort of the highest impacted problems and fix those, and trying to get through those as fast as they can. Section 22 is important because it requires a sufficient water flow. Some people call this ecological flows, and this means that if you're taking water for, say, irrigation or other purposes, industrial purposes, that there's a requirement that you leave a sufficient amount of water for fish to reside. Section 30 is not that exciting, relates to fish guards and screens. Section 32 is probably the biggest one, as well as Section 35. Section 32 is the destruction of fish, so how are you killing fish? And Section 35 is the destruction of fish habitat. So these are the provisions that protect fish and fish habitat. And linguistically, if you are a part of the fish or freshwater world, you're going to learn this acronym that's called a HAD. This is what we're attempting to remove. And this is what all proponents, so people who are wanting to build something, need to ensure that they're not having. And so the Section 35 under the habitat provision says no person shall carry out any work or undertaking that results in the harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of fish habitat, referred to as HADD or HAD. And again, fish habitat is broadly defined in the Fisheries Act. It means anything related to the that directly or indirectly the fish it requires to carry out their life processes, including spawning grounds, nursery rearing, food supply, and migration. Okay, so anything directly, and ironically indirectly has been problematic. So does things like riparian zones, because they indirectly affect fish habitat, mean if you affect riparian zones, it means you have a HAD, and it's been interpreted that in fact that is the case. There's another provision about pollution prevention. This is an interesting one. This prevents the deposition of deleterious substances, and sediment, as well as other chemical pollutants, are considered deleterious substances. Now, interesting, although this is part of the Fisheries Act, this is typically administered by Environment Canada. They do a lot more of the water quality monitoring, and so they typically administer, if there's a Section 36 complaint, they will be the ones who go out to look at it. And in my experience, the deleterious substance of sediment is really problematic, especially in close proximity, if you have construction in close proximity to fresh waters. And so this is sort of one of the reasons I think we have death by 1,000 cuts. All these little projects that are inputting sediment, sediment can be toxic to fish. These are quickly just some policy and guidance documents that are important if you are a proponent or even working as a consultant on behalf of a proponent that you're going to be required to know. So we talk about this a little bit in field school. And so there are different policy frameworks. There's the risk management frameworks, there's operational statements. I'll talk about operational statements. These are basically statements that if you're doing low impact projects that are typically done, road maintenance, for example, Fisheries and Ocean Canada, the federal government, will not require you to go through the owner's process of going through the Fisheries Act. They'll give you this statement and say, follow what's on the statement. Although if you don't follow what's on the statement, we will, penalize you by law. So this has really been like a streamlined process for many of the low impact activities that are often done. And then again, we've talked quickly about it, but the use of explosives or intake and pipe requirements have their own guideline documents. So I mentioned operational statements. These are things like that are quick, that if you're going to do something that are just handed to you and you basically have to follow. These include things like timing windows. So this is promoting that people are not doing in-water activities during sort of sensitive time periods like spawning or any time like overwintering where there might be aggregations of fish that may be impacted by that activity. And so timing windows is one. So they'll tell you you have to work within these timing windows. The use of clear span bridge. So bridges that are clear span do not have moorings within the water. And so if you're able to do that and have no in-water works, they say follow this operational document. Culvert maintenance, not culvert replacement, but culvert maintenance has an operational document. Ice bridges and snowfills, mining exploration activities, moorings, routine maintenance dredging, and temporary stream crossings all have various operational statements. And this is meant to speed up the process for stakeholders or proponents to get onto the landscape relatively quickly. And so if you have one of these low impact situations, they just say follow this advice. Okay, so in summary, we have two legislative frameworks that protect freshwater fishes, the Species at Risk Act and the Fisheries Act. Remember that the Species at Risk Act protects endangered, threatened, extirpated species under Schedule 1. So if you're on a recommended status by COSEWIC, you're not protected. If you're a species of special concern, you're not protected. Only until you've gone through public consultation and reached Schedule 1 do you receive the protections that I mentioned. Fisheries Act protects all species from a HAD and also protects species from destruction. SARA protects the residents or critical habitat. Fisheries Act protects habitat. SARA allows harm through the allowable harm provision in Section 73. And the Fisheries Act we're going to talk about, this is a big one, also allows harm through the authorization of a HAD. So I said we wanted to remove HADs, the harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of habitat, but in fact, you can compensate for this in various ways. Or mitigate, I should say you should first mitigate for it, and then if you can't mitigate, you need to compensate for it by law. And interesting, the Species at Risk Act has been tested, and it's been shown that it's actually the lack of protection that has been the problem. And the Fisheries Act has been legally tested. It's been one of the first acts, actually, when Canada became a country. The Fisheries Act dates back almost to the conception of Canada. And now I'm going to kind of switch gears a little bit, and I'm going to talk to you about how is it that we apply the Fisheries Act and Species at Risk Act to specific projects. And for this, I'm going to talk to you about two of the Department of Fisheries and Oceans pathways of effects model and the risk matrix. So I like these two cartoons about, and I say the difference between traditional environmental management versus where we are now. And so the one on the left was a dinosaur that says, "The picture's pretty bleak, gentlemen. The world's climates are changing, the mammals are taking over, and we all have a brain the size of a walnut." And then crisis clinic just going over. And so what DFO is attempting to do when they ask proponents to go through the Fisheries Act in particular is to use a risk management approach. That is that if you have low impact, they try to speed through the process and use things like operational statements to allow you to continue your work. And they try to scrutinize those higher impact issues so that you're not under these sort of two cartoon scenarios. And so these are the steps as a broad overview that are required for going through the projects, and I'll step through them. So first, you have to define the activities that your project requires. Do we need to put footings or moorings into streams? What do we need to do for construction vehicles? Every aspect as far as what is required for your projects needs to be identified, because there are risks from every one of those actions. To assess those risks, the Fisheries and Oceans asks you to go through the pathways of effects model. And this model is basically an attempt to identify all potential risks and mitigate those. For those that are highlighted here as residual effects, ones that cannot be mitigated, that's what a residual effect is. It's something that we cannot prevent. Use the risk matrix to assess the level of risk, and then determine the appropriate management action. Is it in the green, low impact, low sensitivity to species, or is it in the red? There's high impact and highly sensitive species there. And that's how they go about assessing in a risk management framework. And so one of the key steps in going through this, this framework and pathways of effects in particular is this approach of mitigation. And so why is mitigation important? Well, mitigation means there's no serious effect on fisheries productivity. That means we were able to remove this potential negative effect by mitigating for it in some ways. B, if there's no effect, no authorization from DFO is needed. C, if unacceptable effect equals no authorization given. So if we have so many unmitigatable impacts, residual impacts, then there's the potential that your project will not go. And so no authorization means there's no cumulative effects monitoring. And so all of these are really important aspects of mitigation. You want to mitigate it to reduce harm and the potential that your project is denied, although very few projects have been denied as far as scientific reviews on this topic. So we're going to talk about risk management, and I want you to think about how we assess risk in this period of high declines in freshwater biodiversity, and underestimate the elements of risk and how it's processed through this risk matrix that I'm going to introduce to you now. So this is the broad framework. It is a little bit much to think of off the top of your head, but the first kind of two things are sort of a paper exercise. And so the first one starts off very simply asking, if you're doing a project that has an operational statement, if it's yes, things like culvert maintenance and other operational statements I showed you, if it's yes, you just follow the operational statement and you're done. So then you have sort of a development proposal that was received by DFO. Is there sufficient information? If the answer is no, keep going. You have to go back and redo it. Is fish habitat present? If the answer is no, is this because there's insufficient information? If the answer is there is sufficient information and there's no fish habitat, then you are good to go. There's no requirement under the Fisheries Act. If the answer is yes, fish habitat is present, then you have to go through the pathways of effects analysis that I'm going to show you. You have to assess mitigation. There's a discussion of mitigation objectives between DFO and the proponent. This may require you to kind of go iteratively through this process. And then determine what your negative residuals are, your residual negative effects. So things we cannot mitigate, how bad are they? And from there, we look at the scale of the effect, the sensitivity of fish and fish habitat, and we categorize risk on our risk matrix, which is shown here, but I'll show you in a second. And then if we have to assess, is the risk low? If the risk is low, then there's no HAD likely, and you could proceed, you're in the green. If there's medium risk, HAD is likely, and you typically go through a streamlined process. If there's high risk, you may require site-specific authorization and have site-specific visits. And if there's significant effects, you may be asked to relocate or redesign your project. They may just say move it elsewhere or do it in a different way that reduces these residual negative effects. So that is in essence of what these different frameworks are. And yes, this goal of relocate and redesign is one of the mitigation strategies. So my apologies, I stepped through all these already. So as we go through the process, I mentioned this pathways of effects framework. And so this is sort of a communication tool of understanding all the potential negative impacts a project may have. So you define all your activities, and from defining your activities, you then have to see how you can mitigate those potential effects. Okay, and this allows appropriate mitigation measures to be found. This is what a pathways of effects, different pathways of effects look like. So each one of these little circles has their own pathways of effects model that you have to go through. So there are in-water activities and there are land-based activities, and there's a couple of overlaps. So for in-water activities, things like placement of material, this could be gravel or other types of material, use of industrial equipment, so are you using equipment in water, dredging, water extraction, what are the effects of aquatic vegetation, organic debris management, wastewater management, effects on flow, use of explosives, fish passage, and structural removal. So if your activity, any one of your activities has this, so you're going to have you're going to do a stream diversion, and to do this stream diversion, you're going to use industrial equipment, so you got to go through that, check. You're going to do some water extraction, you're going to check that. You may affect aquatic vegetation, you're going to check that. You may affect flow, you're going to check that, and you're going to go through each one of those pathways of effects. Same for land-based activities. These include vegetative clearing, grading, excavation, explosives, which is a double one, use of industrial equipment, another double one, clearing or maintenance of bridges or other structures, or riparian planting. And so this is just one example of what different, sort of the master pathway of different pathways of effects. And so if you can eliminate any one of these through you not using it, then you don't have to go through that pathway of effect. So what happens if you're left with a negative residual impact? You've gone through your pathways of effects, you've mitigated, or you mitigated as much as you could through relocation, redesign, or other things. Like if we have sedimentation problems, we're putting sediment fences down. I could give 3 lectures on different mitigation methods, but we just don't have time to get into the nitty-gritty. So what happens if you have these residual impacts? Well, now you have to put the totality of those impacts onto this risk matrix. So I'm using an example of a star here. And when we do this, we consider 2 things: the scale of the negative impact, none, so there's no actual requirement for Fisheries Act. You actually would technically not even go to this matrix at this point. Low, medium, or high. Then we look at the sensitivity of fish and or fish habitat. If there's none, again, you're not required to do this. Is it low, is it moderate, or is it highly sensitive? And so we consider all sorts of things for the scale of negative effect. The scope, duration, and timing of the negative effect all play a role in defining how much of an effect it is. And for sensitivity of species, we look at all different effects of fish and fish habitat. So is it a species at risk that's in high decline, or is it a sort of widespread species? And so once you place where this star is on here, then you have your sort of the measures you need to do to receive an authorization. And so if we're under the low category for the effect and for the sensitivity, in fact, even up to medium, you can see largely these are guided by operational statements or quick letters of advice. These are typically 1 or 2 page letters. The DFO says, do it this way, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are other now developed best management practices for things like soil and erosion control is a big one, and they'll say follow the best management practices or guidelines, etc. If you are the yellow, it's typically a streamlined process that requires some authorizations that are clearly defined and you must follow by law. If it's in the sort of higher risk category here in orange, it may require site-specific review and authorization. And in the red, these are significant negative effects, which may require some further requirements or compensation. Compensation could be are typically required for things that are in the orange or red, and they could vary as far as, is it a cash payment? Is it, what are you doing as far as compensation? But I would argue that although this risk matrix is very nice as far as a communication tool, most often Fisheries and Oceans Canada, the regulator, will ask you to do as much mitigation as you can to get into the green so that they could handle this through very simple processes. And so this risk management framework is an attempt to put more emphasis on higher risk and higher sensitivity projects and to put less emphasis on these low risk projects. But I think the ironic thing is when we think about the earlier part of this lecture of the loss of biodiversity, and I mentioned that death by 1,000 cuts through habitat alteration, I think this is where we're losing the battle. This low scrutiny on these quote unquote low effects add up cumulatively over time. And although there are sort of nice messages about incorporating cumulative effects, there is no model to do that as of yet. So this is in a nutshell how we go about applying things to a project. But as you can see, there are many opportunities for there to be negative residual impacts on fish and fish habitat that are authorized by law through the Fisheries Act. And this can be a problem. So what happens, so remember that fish habitat includes all the processes it needs to carry out its life processes directly or indirectly, and that no person should technically have a HAD. So how do we compensate if we have a HAD on fish habitat, so something that affects fish directly or not? So HADs can be authorized, so we can contravene this if the risk to the species can be mitigated on site. So this is basically that risk matrix. So can we mitigate these things? If you can't, then you need to develop a compensation plan. And the ideal approach is that if you're removing habitat, you replace it like for like, which means if I'm taking out a spawning bed for pike, because I have to do some in-water works, I'm going to put another spawning bed back that is like for like, similar, or the same. And typically you do that in a 2-to-1 framework. I put twice as much back because we want to give it some net benefit. You typically want to put it back in the same or similar area. And if you can't do that, like for like in the same or similar area, you need to put habitat returned of a similar client close by. If the risks are unacceptable, the project cannot be authorized as designed, and you may be asked to relocate or redesign your project. Can you put it somewhere else that has less impacts? So a bit of a refresher, the Fisheries Act attempts to eliminate all harmful alteration, disruption, or destruction of fish habitat through mitigation processes or relocation and redesign. Fisheries Act authorizations are allowed and issued only if the HAT is acceptable, and the authorization is contingent upon a sort of compensation plan if it's sort of in those higher risk categories. Okay, so I mentioned this, like for like, and so this is what we aim to do, like for like of the same habitat, create or increase the capacity of unlike habitat in the same unit, create or increase productive capacity in a different ecological unit, and then these things that are called measures of last resort. And so the compensation framework, or the now called the offsetting framework, has been debated, and one of the issues that people have is, what is the measure of last resort? And so industrial partners have come and said, you know what, we're going to build a huge oil sands mine and we have to divert a river. We can't put the river back because we have mining operations. We can't put the river unlike habitat, or we could put some unlike habitat. We've been building these things called compensation lakes in the oil sands region, but they haven't been very effective. And we really don't want to put something in a different ecological unit. What if we were just to stock fish as a measure of last resort? And so far there's been pushback on this, but it's a really dangerous slope of saying we could use things like stocking, or we can compensate monetarily by buying things like habitat credits, which is a really area of great interest from my research group, and an area that Canada is just freshly going through. Can we allow industry to buy credits for habitat, and then we have industrial people go and build those habitat credits or preserve habitat credits somewhere else? The United States has this kind of crediting system, and Canada is currently looking at those frameworks. And if you're interested to learn more about it, I would just say go to my website. You can just search Mark Poesch, and we've got a number of papers on habitat banking and sort of the sort of difficulties that habitat banking presents. Okay, so this is from most preferred to least preferred. Okay, so the elephant in the room is, how do we deal with these issues of things like huge surface mines that are, you know, diverting rivers? We really struggle with this because under most scenarios, if you're destroying, say, a spawning bed and you could replace a spawning bed in the same area, that has been well studied and well documented. It could generally work well if you return twice as much as you've damaged. The problem is when you have like for unlike replacement. We're taking out a river and we're putting in a lake somewhere else. Well, that's an apples to orange comparison, and so that is sort of the elephant in the room. How do we go about compensating for these issues? And so I'll leave it there. I notice I'm pretty close to the 50-minute mark. I'm sorry if this feels rushed, but if you have any questions, please feel free to email me at Poesch, that is the letter Poesch, at ualberta.ca, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. And I hope you have a wonderful day.